It's really an honor to share a few words of introduction for Rabbi Kanefsky. In addition to the very impressive resume, which I think you can read about in his bio, there's a couple things. First, personally, Rabbi Kanefsky was the one who called me and I guess invited me. Do you remember? Right, invited me to become part of the board of rabbis and to serve on the executive committee after many years. So I don't know if to congratulate you or to use this opportunity as a litany of why my life has been incredibly tortured since then. But I am very grateful for that because it really has, through him, really has anchored my involvement with the colleagues that we've come to share in Los Angeles. And I think today is just a shining, glowing example of what it is that we do together. And I'm so glad that the annual conference does bring us together in the way that it does. And I've had a distinct privilege not only to serve with him on the executive committee. I believe that you were the past president at the time. That was your glorious responsibility, is to nominate new people to come on to the committee. But it was also, I think you went on one of the trips to the Gulf Coast and after Hurricane Katrina, which was also a very, very impactful experience for me personally, for my community, and also for my involvement with the Board of Rabbis, which was an active response to a catastrophe that really befell the southeastern United States, and it was our ability to respond with hammers and with presence to really bring healing. So not only does Rabbi Kanefsky exhibit insight into how to bring this community together, and I think that his model as an Orthodox rabbi and being in conversation with the many streams of Judaism is exemplary and something worthy of us to celebrate, but it's also really being shoulder to shoulder, hand to hand, arm in arm, hammer to hammer with Rabbi Kanefsky, and knowing that we have this great task of healing the world that I think is not only by example but also by our learning today we're going to have the privilege to experience. So please, Rabbi Kanefsky.
Thank you very, very much. Those were great memories. Even being in Mississippi after a disaster, it felt wonderful to be there as Jews, as rabbis. I don't remember what year that was anymore. It was a long time ago.
It was about 14 years ago now. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you. I've had, over the last 3 years, the real privilege of being part of the Rabbinic Fellowship at the Hartman Institute that goes on for 3 years. This past summer was the fourth summer of 3 somehow. And over that course of that time, to get to know a lot of the people that, if you've been to the Hartman Institute at all, you've undoubtedly had the privilege of studying with. And the two people in particular whose teachings I will try to convey and share right now are Tal Becker and Daniel Hartman. So I'm going to start with Daniel. And I chose these two particular teachings because I think that they address issues that we are grappling with, that our constituencies are grappling with. I hear in the voices of so many of my colleagues in the Hartman cohort the real pain of talking with their own congregants who are questioning whether they identify any longer as Zionists. I mean, this is gut-wrenching stuff. And it is the Hartman way. And again, if you've been there, you know, and I apologize if I'm repeating anything you already know, to try to frame issues such that people of differing perspectives and opinions can meaningfully engage because there's a common vernacular. There's a common set of values, a common set of terms that can lead to applications that people disagree about, but there's a root that we share and that enables conversations to happen in a respectful way, in a deep way, and hopefully in an enriching way. So the first of the two teachings has to do with Jerusalem. Right? So that was something small. And there are many different aspects I will not be touching upon. The issue that may be closest to the hearts of many in this room, of the place for non-Orthodox prayer in Jerusalem. We'll touch on it briefly. but I know I'm choosing not to touch upon it because I don't know what to say about it. It's frustrating. It's just frustrating. But the issue of sovereignty, right? Not more than 2 days ago, right? On Tisha B'Av, as always happens on Tisha B'Av, the Har HaBayit once again comes into focus. And the Har HaBayit is, of course, just a part of the larger Labriut. Part of the Labriut, a part of the larger question as to how Israel should be exercising sovereignty in Jerusalem, what the relationship is between Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem and the rights of others in Jerusalem. All of these questions that are so leading and so difficult. And I remember this I have in my handwritten notes. I'm the last person still taking handwritten notes of these things. Where Daniel opened and said, for 2,000 years we've become very developed and sophisticated in the ways in which we mourn for Jerusalem. We've had about 50 years to learn how to be sovereigns of Jerusalem, and we have not even begun to really figure out what it means to be sovereigns of Jerusalem. And the idea, just as a point of departure, the idea that there's something enormously powerful for us as the Jewish people to be sovereigns of Jerusalem should not and cannot be underestimated. Jerusalem is the city of God. Jerusalem is the city of the Bible. By taking and holding Jerusalem, I think more than 1948, more than anything else, we as the Jewish people reemerged as a major world religion. We now have the platform from which to speak God's word, from which to say, this is what God is thinking. And we know that we have the right to do that because, after all, it is the people to whom, this is what people have always thought, right? It is the people to whom God has given control of his city who have acquired the right to say what God thinks. We have been privileged by God to express God's truth. There is something incredibly powerful about as a Jewish people, being the sovereigns of Jerusalem, and our reemergence onto the stage of history as not a once upon a time world religion, not as a world religion that gets kicked around and oppressed, but as a world religion that really speaks. And one mustn't ever, when we think about, I wish this wouldn't be happening on Har HaBayit. I wish that a lot of what's driving is the sense that this is the very core of our identity as a great world religion, is Jerusalem. At the same time, and here we'll begin with a text study, except that, save one for myself. Here we'll begin with a text study, and this was really kind of Daniel's first and to me the most striking point, that being the sovereign of God's city almost makes no sense at all. Right? Because whose city is it?
God.
It's God's city. And if it's God's city, who is the sovereign of God's city? God. And what is the most heretical idea you could possibly articulate about being sovereign over God's city? Is that I, a human being, am sovereign over God's city because I'm sovereign over God. It is a contradiction in terms. It is inherently not only meaningless but even blasphemous to declare oneself the sovereign over God's city, because it is implicitly to say you are sovereign over God. And there are a couple of texts that I offer here. The first is from Melachim Aleph. Context, of course, is when Shlomo is dedicating the Beit HaMikdash. Shlomo understands well what he has not done. Right?
Are there more copies by chance?
If they are, they're out there somewhere. Thank you. Shlomo understands what he has not done, right? He famously says, Hashamayim u'shmei hashamayim lo yechal kalucha. The heavens and the heavens above the heavens cannot contain you, God. Af ki lo habayit hazeh. Certainly this house that I have built certainly can't contain you. It's a remarkable thing that Shlomo is saying. I know I am selling this as God's house, but I know in my heart there's no such thing. How could God be in a house? How could I have built a house for God? It's really that question of how could I be so presumptuous as to say I'm God's landlord. I'm housing God. I'm sovereign over God. And the way in which the story plays out, I'm just looking at those last two verses. Right, the Kohanim go into the Holy of Holies for the first time in Shlomo's new house. And what's the first thing that happens there? The very last pasuk. The Kohanim can't even stand there because who has filled the house? Because God has filled the house. And the idea that this is our house that we have built and we control it and we are the sovereigns over it, we can't even step inside. It's because it's not ours. It is transcendent of all things human. And the arrogance of saying we are sovereigns over Jerusalem is unmistakable. I think about Yirmiyahu. I think about Yirmiyahu a lot. You think about Yirmiyahu a lot? Yeah, I think about Yirmiyahu a lot. I think about the Rembrandt painting. You know what I'm talking about? Yirmiyahu, I think it's Yirmiyahu at the time of the Khurban. You have never seen a man looking more dejected because I tried. Nothing. No one's listening. Okay. This is Yirmiyahu, early on, to the extent that the book is in chronological order. So early on, God comes to Yirmiyahu, and let's just pick out a couple of verses. Could someone read the second verse, thus says the Lord of hosts? Well, we're rabbis, we know how to do this.
Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, mend your ways and your actions, and I will let you dwell in this place.
Keep going, just bottom of the page.
Don't put your trust in illusions and say, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these buildings.
But which is what the false prophets are saying. Don't worry, nothing can happen, nothing bad can occur. It's the temple of the Lord, right? That's illusions.
No, if you really mend your ways and your actions, if you execute justice between one man and another, if you do not oppress the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, if you do not shed the blood of the innocent in this place, if you do not follow other gods to your own hurt,
right,
then only will I let you dwell in this place, in the land that I gave you to your fathers for all time.
No, it's pretty clear. Whose city is this? This is God's city. Who are we in this city? What's our role in this city? Where on the contract did we sign? We're the tenants. And the rules are very, very clear, as you just enumerated them. God said these are, no pets, and not no pets, orphans, widows. I mean, this is the contract we sign at the bottom of the contract. And somehow to think, and this is what the false prophets are saying, oh yeah, we're the landlords. Did you read that thing before you signed it? We're not the landlords. We are here in order to create something. We're here in order to serve God. We're here in order to realize a vision for the nation and ultimately beyond just the nation. And if we skip all the way down to the end of that citation, last two verses on this side. Yes, please.
Tell me where I said.
Last one. Therefore I will do to the house.
Therefore I will do to the house which bears my name, on which you rely, and to the place which I gave you and your fathers, just what I did to Shiloh, and I will cast you out of my presence as I cast out your brothers, the whole brood of the firmament.
Okay. And so here is the conversation, right? On the one hand, to not in any way underestimate or undervalue how significant it is for the Jewish people, after all we have been through for the last thousands of years, how significant it is to say we are in Jerusalem. We have moral stature. We have stature as a world religion. We are not the butt of history's joke anymore. Never. That's something that we can all appreciate. And the other side of that coin is the intrinsic absurdity of asserting oneself as sovereign over God's city. And somewhere in that tension, and that's the work to be done, of course, right? Somewhere in that tension, deep conversations can be had, and real thoughts, even especially among people who disagree, can be had. If we start with where the frame is, what are the pieces that create the frame, the terms of engagement, of this kind of conversation. The second piece about Jerusalem, then I really want to move on to Tal Becker, which blew my mind, is the way in which Jerusalem is at one and the same time the capital of the Jewish people and something else. It is, and now I'm thinking, I just fill in U.S. Embassy, fill in whatever you want to fill in here, right? Is it the capital of the Jewish people? Of course it is. Was it David HaMelech's capital? Of course it was. Was it the capital of all the kings of Yehudah? Of course it was. Was it the place to which went Aliyah LaRegel, that all of Israel, even beyond the borders, and we came from Bavel and God knows where else, to Aliyah LaRegel? Is it the center of the Jewish people? Of course it's the center of the Jewish people. And a geographic center, because we're people, last time we checked, not angels, a geographic center is something that holds us together. Even when there were no Jews in Jerusalem, right? At the end of every Pesach Seder, at the end of Ne'ilah every year, that was our geographic center that made this whole story coherent. And at the same time, that it is the center of the Jewish people, what else is it? Again, going back to Shlomo. Can I ask you, do you have oh, you have one. Okay, good. Okay, go ahead. It's the same speech. Shlomo says, let me just give it the context and then you read it. God, whenever the children of Israel look to this city and pray here, looking toward this city, may you answer them, may you be receptive to them, and even more. Bakasha.
Or if a foreigner who is not of your people, Israel, comes from a distant land for the sake of your name. For they shall hear about your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm when he comes
the
to
foreigner, pray, yes.
When he comes to pray towards his house. Oh, here in your heavenly abode, that grant all that the foreigner asks you for.
Right. And the commentaries point out that Shlomo is going beyond. Grant the Jews, what they deserve when they pray to you. Grant the foreigner, whatever, kitchen sink.
Anything and everything.
Yeah.
Thus all the peoples of the earth will know your name and revere you, as does your people Israel. And they will recognize that your name is attached to this house, to this house that I have built. So
Jerusalem is our capital, and what else is it?
What you call a universal
Everybody's.
portal, you're saying?
Right. This is a place where it is our aspiration. Part of our aspiration for our capital is that it be a center for the world to recognize God. Isaiah, right? Isaiah 2, fill that in. Bakasha.
So that's one way to read it, but it's also possible that the foreigner comes and finds this a center as opposed to the center.
Right.
And And if that's the case, which means that a foreigner comes in and absolutely respects the center of the universe as it is held to by the Jewish people, but it may not be the center for somebody else. So it's like a vacation destination. Like they come in and they're like, wow, it's wonderful.
Absolutely granted. And what I'm inferring is I didn't say what I wanted to say as clearly as I wanted to say it. So thank you. Right. In other words, when we figure out, well, how do we want to run our capital so that our capital achieves the purposes that we have. Right? We want our capital to be a place that, even if it's just a center, not the center, we want our capital to be perceived, experienced, visited as a capital for spirituality and prayer of all people. What implications does that have for how we package our city, how we market our city, how we want our city to be perceived, the openness of our city, the welcome of our city, the eagerness with which we embrace everyone in our city? If that's part of our goal, that's part of our PR, to put it in crass terms.
Sure.
Right? What does it have to look like?
Are you focusing on people visiting, or are you also including people who want to live there that aren't Israeli?
Right? I'm opening the conversation. Right? What I'm doing is, right, yes, right? So you're thinking along these lines. This is, again, a second frame, right? Just as the first frame is intended to create room for a conversation that includes people who think differently and have different opinions, but we can all agree on a kind of a common frame. This is another frame. It is our capital historically. It is our capital even when we weren't there, L'Shana Haba Yerushalayim. And at the same time, part of our aspiration for our capital is that others, and this is the other, how you define others, that's all part of the, that's the deep conversation for which this is merely the frame. How we want others to perceive and feel, whether they are living here, whether they are visiting here. So now I'm going to switch gears. Is that okay? Okay. Switching gears. Tal Becker, who is, he works in the, I'm forgetting it, it's the legal, he's a lawyer, right? And he works, he's been involved in Israeli diplomacy and government forever and ever and ever and ever. I forget precisely what kind of law he does. Anyways, he is forthright, candid, brilliant, and he has a very deep Jewish learning background of his own. And he gave a shiur, I believe it was a Shabbat afternoon, and therefore my notes must have been written after Shabbat, so I apologize to whatever degree they don't reflect what he said. But he gave a very powerful shiur about red lines, moral red lines. At what point, if any, is it legitimate to say, I can't associate myself any longer with this enterprise because this enterprise has crossed the moral red line? Right? That's, man, what a question. The flip side of the question is, how much tolerance do I need to have for moral compromise? Right? That's a different way of formulating the same question, but it is kind of the other side of that coin. At what point do I have to detach myself because a moral red line has been crossed? How much moral compromise must I be able to tolerate? And you can, again, go anywhere you want. I think the year that he gave this, I wrote down in my notes, Eritrean immigrants, intervention or non-intervention in Syria, anything and everything related to the West Bank, you can go on. Think weapon sales. I mean, think about whatever you want to think about, right? Whatever moral lines to think about. And Tal did something remarkable. He did two things that were remarkable. The first thing he did is he took a text that we all know. It's the bottom there. Oh no, it's the next page. 1 second. Skip. No, Rambam. Yeah.
Bottom of 2.
Rambam. No, so it's the last page. I skipped a bunch of stuff. I'm just keeping one eye on the clock here. You see, it's the last page. Mishnah Torah, Sodei Torah 5:1.
Yeah, it's in the
It's
back.
the last page, I think. Back page. Yeah. And this is a text that we're all familiar with. Rambam is talking about the laws of sanctifying the name of God and when you need to surrender your life rather than sin in order to sanctify Kiddush Hashem. And if you look at the opening halacha 5:1, he opens, it is mandatory to sanctify the great names, the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. Quotes the verse in Leviticus, etc., etc. And then fourth line, how are these commandments, the commandment to sanctify the name of God, how is it to be observed? Someone picked that up. If an idolater
will force an Israelite to transgress one of the commandments of the Torah and threaten him with death for...
You think the rest of the sentence is going to be, what do?
Die.
It
Not the rest
is
of it.
mandatory that he transgress the commandment and be not put to death, for it is said concerning the commandments, that which a man may do and live by it, but not die by it. Thus, if he chooses death and did not transgress, his blood be upon his own head.
Surprise! Of course, Rambam then gets to, but not 1, 2, and 3. Okay, fine. And we'll talk about that in a second, of course. That's important. But the main mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem is you're facing a situation in which, now I'm channeling Tal as best I can. The mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem is you're facing a situation in which you have to compromise. You're being asked to do something, being forced to do something that you find objectionable, to say the least. But what's the alternative? Death. In 610 out of 613 circumstances, what do you do? What do you choose?
Yes.
Choose life. Choose desecration of whatever it is, whatever violation of whatever mitzvah it is, and choose life. Is that deeply morally compromised? Yeah, on some level it is. You're doing something that really runs contrary to what you believe, what you've been taught. But the mitzvah of sanctifying God's name is to say, I'm going to live. And Tal went on, and you see the other sources there, to say that, and this was, we kind of turned our heads over. He said, Yoser or vorei choshech, oseh shalom, vorei, and the real word in Yeshaya, vorei et hara. God created the world this way. It ain't perfect. There's bad players. There are bad things. And you're going to say, well, I'm going to always stand on my principles, and I don't accept God's world the way it is. Sorry, God. I don't accept that this is a flawed world. I don't accept that this is a place where we have to compromise sometimes. I have in my own head a different world than the one you created, God. That's a desecration of God's name. Sanctifying God's name, Tal was teaching, is recognizing that this is a compromised universe that God created. Why God created it that way, that's a whole other discussion. This is the way God created it. And sanctifying God's name is recognizing that this is the way God created the world. It's very hard. You can't always stick to your principles and live. And you're going to do the darn best that you can in God's world as it is, even though that means there are many times when you have to compromise things that are precious to you, compromise values, compromise. And then the discussion, of course, becomes there are exceptions, right? And that's where the red lines need to be drawn. Rabbi Geller.
Even before you get to the exceptions, it's still not clear how you make decisions about political issues. One could argue that I'm compromising my love for Israel by not being connected to Israel. In other words, not exactly clear what the car is.
Okay, so that's a very valid point. The discussion that Tal is inviting all of us into is, I guess, based on the idea that, let me think about what you're saying. Right. Yeah, I mean, you're right. At a certain point, a person could say that the value I'm going to compromise in order so that I stay alive is my attachment to Israel. Right? That could be said. Yep. And that's what makes this an interesting conversation. Yeah. Can I go on just a little bit further and then we'll...
I just have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Because one of the exceptions is idolatry, and so then the question is, what is idolatry?
Yeah, okay, right. So that's where we're going now. Right. So, and again, this is all, very Machon Hartman-esque. The idea here is not to say, oh, that's the question, this is the answer. Right? The idea is, let's create this kind of framework within which we can have this conversation. Right? So then the question, of course, then becomes, what is Avodah Zarah? What is Shlichut Damim? And what is Gilu Arayot? So I will share what Tal did with these three, in particular the last one, which certainly was the weakest but the most powerful. And again, I'm emphasizing, I'm hoping this has been clear, but this is not about providing pat answers for anything. It is just the opposite, right? It's about creating a conversation that people can use terms that one another can understand and use those common terms and language. So he talked about Avodah Zarah, and I think two generic terms to be ultimately meaningful. It's the third one I want to get to. Talk about Avodah Zarah as having no moral calculus at all, being answerable to nobody, only to yourself. Self-worship, Avodah Zarah, there is no transcendent presence, however defined, to which I am responsible or accountable. I am purely accountable to my self-interest. Avodah Zarah. The second, Shlichut Damim, he talked about Shlichut Damim in terms of not recognizing at all that there are actual human beings on the other side of whatever conflict, on the other side of the fence in Gaza, wherever it may be. And this, goes to how Tzahal does its work and doing what it can to avoid harming non-combatants and defining non-combatants and v'chule v'chule. And that's the conversation of Shlichut Damim. Obviously, we're engaged perpetually, tragically, in conflict and warfare. That's Oseh Shalom V'Orei Torah. That's our reality. And there's going to be a certain amount of moral compromise that we have to live with, because literally that's V'chai B'hem. But at what point does it become Shlichut Damim? And again, he talked about having no regard at all for the reality of human life on the other side of the battle line. And the last one, the one that, the reason I will spend a couple of extra minutes on this one of the three, even though all three are important to talk about, and I know I have only 4 minutes left. I got them. You don't have to give me the signal, I got it.
Yeah, you're good.
So he said, the Gilui Rayot, I'm going to take real license here. And so much so that I remember how he even, he's like completely debasing oneself ethically. Okay. And then he told a story. And This is, for me, one of my Hartman moments that I will never forget. In fact, when we went around at our last check-in, because, it's very touchy-feely and everything, and so give us over the last 3 years, the thing you'll never forget. This is the thing I'll never forget. Tal Becker is, have you heard him speak? He is, says it like it is. He's cold. No, he's not cold, but, intellectual and clinical and not analytical. And so he tells the story, if you remember a couple of years ago, terrible story, an act of arson, presumably carried out by Jews on the West Bank, an act of arson that burns a family's home, resulting in the death of one of the children of the family. His name was Ali. And the perpetrators were tried, and they were brought to court. And as the parents of Ali were leaving the courtroom, they were taunted by sympathizers of the perpetrators. Ali is on the grill. Where is Ali? Ali is on the grill. And which for Tal, that was the complete self-debasement. We are utterly surrendering any claim of morality, of religion, of ethics. And the reason I'll never forget this is that Tal began to sob as he told this story. If you can't imagine Tal Becker sobbing, neither could any of us. But he sobbed as he told this story. That this was a moral line, that if someone said, I just can't anymore. Now, again, it was a group of young, it was a small group of people. It wasn't the nation of Israel doing it, but it was an example of where a moral red line is, to completely self-debase morally and religiously, so much so that you're capable of that kind of cruelty. So to step back from it, his message, and I guess the message that through him I'm conveying, is that these conversations, go back to that, the question, is there a line at which I would have to say I cannot associate myself with the state of Israel anymore? Rather than a question that question can't even be asked. That's a heretical question in in American Zionism. It can't be asked. How can you say that? Rather than saying that question can't be asked, which often just has the result of people who ask the question just kind of wandering off on their own without there having been any conversation. Have the conversation. Have the conversation in a way that we can establish a common frame. A frame in which this is a world of moral compromise. It's God's world. That's the way God made it. Don't know why. That's not the issue. But b'chai b'hem, living and not dying, is a sanctification of the name of God, even when it involves moral, or specifically involves moral compromise. Which doesn't mean that there aren't red lines. There still are red lines, and we can talk about together what those red lines are, but only in the larger context of understanding that not every moral compromise is a red line. It just isn't. That's not the world. That's not the universe. That's not Judaism either. Anyway, so whether it's about Yerushalayim, moral red lines, the idea is create frameworks for conversations that enable people to be honest, to be candid, to be deep, and to use language and terms that are deeply, deeply rooted in Tanakh and Halakha, that allow for room for profound disagreement and kind of keeps everyone in the conversation together. Shana Tova.